FBW began in 1989, and it was a perfect time because up until that point, Hoboken had a well-regarded reputation for being a graveyard for developers. There weren't any successful projects that had gone up on the waterfront. But in 1989, the Port Authority of New York came forward with a plan for Pier A through Pier C because they had a long-term lease on the piers, but at the same time there was no longer any shipping traffic. At one point the Holland American line used to sail for Europe. But the unfortunate thing was that the Port Authority wanted to build a 35-story building on the pier. And that was sufficient motivation for people to, for the first time, get very interested in their waterfront and to come very quickly to understand that if that building had been built, there would be no public waterfront. What we did with FBW, largely under the leadership of Ron Hine, who is still the executive director and has been a magic and relentless force for creative and constructive change in Hoboken. We began a planning process, and the first step in it was really an education process. We wanted to tell people what a public waterfront was. And essentially, a public waterfront's a pretty simple operation. It means having the front door face the water. You want people to have margaritas, you want to have the FedEx guy come, you want to be able to have windows that show goods for sale, but you won't get those kinds of things unless you have a street, which marks the difference between the public and private. So the front door facing the water only happens when you have a street for the front door to face. Now that was difficult for people because it was a kind of complex thought. So many believed when we began this work. But then you say to people, you know, Central Park is bounded by streets. So is Gramercy Park. So is Washington Square Park. So are most city parks. People began to understand that having a street, as strange as that may seem, you would think, well, streets mean cars, and cars mean traffic, and traffic means that you're separated from the water. Not so. If you handle it correctly, if you put in the right kind of controls, you get the front door facing the water. So on the Hoboken waterfront now, those places that sit between 1st and 4th Street where you can get a beer and you can sit outside, were not there at all, and neither was Pier A. So Pier A, that big, magnificent pier, was essentially an FBW creation. It is open and green grass because of an agreement with the Port Authority that they would build the square feet they were going to build anyway on the other side of the street. So the beer, the margaritas, the FedEx guy, the postman, all are there now because essentially we have a street and we have a waterfront which is public on one side and private on the other. There are some wonderful examples which have the same importance to their respective cities as Pier A and the waterfront park does to Hoboken. Maybe the best example is the Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro. And it's a very, very simple plan. Another example, a grand example, is Chicago. And it's largely the work of Daniel Burnham, a famous Chicago architect, who at the beginning of the 20th century realized that all of the old piers and slaughterhouses and merchandising, shipping, warehousing was going to disappear. And in one grand sweep, he sketched out a public waterfront. People sometimes ask, well, can you give me an example of a really poor waterfront, one where people tried and it just didn't happen? And there are two examples near Hoboken. The first is Shelter Bay, north of here between Hoboken and the George Washington Bridge. And quite faithfully, the developer put in a 30-foot walkway behind the condominiums that he had built. And then as people began using the walkway, he put up 2 chain link fences, one at either end. And this left government, this left the mayor and the state of New Jersey with an absolutely intolerable proposition because they were faced with the fact that the law said that the walkway had to stay open. Well, the problem wasn't the politicians, the problem wasn't the city officials, the problem was the plan. and it was a plan which had the back doors facing the water rather than the front doors. Perhaps an even better example is Riva Point, which is in Weehawken. Now, Riva Point is built on a large pier. Law says that you have to have a public walkway. But to make sure that people do not feel that it's public, they have a large set of gates at the front. They always make me think that you're arriving at Buckingham Palace and that you're not going to go have lunch with the Queen until indeed the gates have been opened. But those gates are gates to a public park that runs down the middle of the pier. You know, FBW has, from the beginning, had as a mission statement, a continuous public waterfront. And one of the really fun moments in this long journey was the construction of a model of the waterfront, which you can see behind me. And we built the model using citizen labor. FBW, of course, couldn't afford to get a professional model maker. But more importantly, we were able to have people come in, they'd bring their X-Acto knives, or we'd give them one, and basswood, and you could make your own block. And one woman who was particularly active in this said that she had wanted to contribute once she understood what a public waterfront meant. People ask, will this public waterfront idea really come finally to fruition? Because there are parts of the waterfront that are still not built. And it's a good question, because you can't really tell the future, but you can say with some confidence that once people understand what a public waterfront means, you build support in an ongoing way for that typical condition to continue. There are many people now who, as soon as you say public waterfront, continuous public waterfront, know exactly what you mean and go to the battlements to make sure that a private developer isn't going to stick his foot in and wreck the plan. Maxwell Place is a good example of how FBW has operated in the past, and it was a terrific story. The developers had acquired the coffee factory and had wanted to build condominiums on the waterfront, right on the large pier. And FBW prepared a plan, a quick sketch plan, sat down and talked with the developers and showed them that they could build the same amount of square footage and also get a public park out of it simply by moving the buildings from the waterfront back to the other side of the street. And what ensued was really quite heartening and maybe a model for other places in Hoboken, in that the developers and FBW created an escrow account, and we began to work on a plan with the developers to quantify, to give more specificity to the park that was going to be on the waterfront. And because of that, the developers' plan changed dramatically. But because of FBW's participation, those 5 acres ended up on the waterfront as a waterfront park. People ask, what's FBW doing now? Well, one of the big projects, in fact, in some ways, the biggest project that has ever happened in Hoboken is the plan, or the desire to have a plan for the rail yards on the south side of Observer Highway. The rail yards are a very important example of how FBW works. Developers came forward with New Jersey Transit to show a plan which was roundly hooted out of court, and the city in the meantime hired its own planner, and the developers went back and made a second plan, and FBW said, gee, neither of these are really doing what needs to be done. The first step in planning a piece of ground, whether it's condominiums in Florida or Colonel Stevens, who laid out the city of Hoboken, is to lay out the blocks and to do the streets. It's interesting because FBW is not under the umbrella of the city, nor are they working for the developer, but FBW has gone back and forth now to city officials and to the developer to put together a plan which would really make sense. You know, when you look back and say, what would Hoboken be like if there hadn't been any FBW? And I guess the best comparison might be Newport, next door. Large towers, open space which is not useful, and isn't used. Streets which have a suburban character and is unfortunately characteristic of many American cities which have turned over control to private developers without crafting for themselves a role for the public. And FBW from its beginning has been really the public's advocate. It's interesting because FBW relies almost entirely on volunteers. There's no real staff. FBW, through its board, takes on projects which they think are in the public interest, and they raise money to make the plans that are needed to begin the conversation. FBW funds go to research, they go to hiring planners, engineers, people with technical skills, all of whom are needed to put forward the FBW case for a particular project. But it's a unique organization in that it is not top-heavy, really is run on a rather skimpy amount of money, but it relies on people giving, and giving generously, I might say, in order to keep FBW hot on the trail of the next piece of the waterfront that needs to be attended to from a public point of view.